This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with some help with the content of Lesson 6, in which we study Articles 8 and 9 in Gildersleeve's Latin grammar. Remember, in the first lesson I explained that Gildersleeve's Latin grammar is a reference grammar, and I explained that it contains far more information than you need to know to be able to read Latin fluently. The information that's contained in this grammar is sufficient for lifelong Latin studies. So as you get into the language and begin to come across different exceptions to rules and different variations or different spellings or changes in different periods of the history of the Latin language, this Latin grammar book will provide you with guidance and historical information on all of those different issues. So just remember that we're not going to study formally all of the content of this Latin textbook, but at the same time, we want to be familiar with it because we want to know what's actually in this book. So if a question ever arises for us, we know where that information can be found. So in this lesson, in Lesson 6, we enter into a study of variations or changes in vowels and consonants that can be pretty confusing. And as you can see, if I scroll through this, remember we're studying Articles 8 and 9 in Lesson 6. If I scroll through this, you can see just how much information is included in this section. Let's just scroll through and take a look. Here's Article 8. It goes all through this page here, down into this page. Here we find Article 9, and then we have all of this information that continues down all the way through this page down to Article 10, which is Lesson 7. So you can see there's lots of information here about changes in the sounds or spellings of Latin words, and we don't need to learn all of the details of this information, but we do need to be familiar with what is contained here, just so that in the future, if there's ever a question, we know what this section contains and we'll even think to look it up. So that's the purpose of studying this. So for Lesson 6, our goal is just to become familiar with the content of Articles 8 and 9. You can see again the title of this section is Phonetic Variations in Vowels and Consonants. Phonetic variations in vowels and consonants. And phonetic has to do with letters and sounds. So changes in spellings and sounds with vowels and consonants. That's the subject of Lesson 6 and the content of Articles 8 and 9. So you can see that in Article 8, we look at changes in vowels in words, and then down in Article 9, we look at the changes in consonants. So it's simple to see how this is arranged. Vowels in Article 8, consonants in Article 9. So let's just take an easy walk through these two articles and make ourselves familiar with the content. So the topic is variations in vowels and consonants. And we have to ask, why do these changes, why do these variations take place? The reason is because when we change the forms of words, remember Latin is an inflected language. Latin expresses different ideas in the language by changing the forms of its words. We do this a little bit in English, but not too much. For example, a very simple example would be, for a singular object, we use one form, and then to make a plural, we may add an S to the word. So we change the spelling of the word to show that we're referring to a plural subject. We could say boy, for example, and that means one boy. But then we can change the word to signify more than one boy. We can say boys and just add that S at the end, and it conveys a different idea. The changing of the forms of the words allows us to express greater detail in our language. However, when we make those changes, sometimes the changes that occur cause some difficulty in the relationships between the letters and sounds of the word. The most important problem is that it makes it difficult to pronounce. So we may have a certain rule for changes, but if that change is carried out on a certain word, how that change relates to the rest of the word may make the word very awkward to pronounce. And so rather than ask everyone to wrestle through this word and pronounce an awkward word, we simply change the word to make it easier to pronounce. And as we study language, we've got to be aware of those changes. We've got to understand what the changes represent. And when we see a certain word, we've got to think about what might be happening in that word based on different endings, different prefixes, suffixes, different stems of words, so that we can guess sometimes what's going on. So because of the trouble caused by the changes of the words, and the trouble has to do with pronunciation, we call this euphony, or simply good sound. It sounds well. Euphony is a concern we have in language, and when we find something that doesn't sound well or is difficult to articulate, we can change it to improve the language. And so that's what we're studying here in Articles 8 and 9. Different changes that take place so that language can be clearer and smoother, easier to speak, and also more pleasant to hear. So let's look at some of these changes that take place in vowels. The first change that takes place in vowels is called weakening, where a stronger vowel is weakened. So the first change is weakening. Let's read this. In the formation of words from roots or stems, short vowels show a tendency to weaken. Notice it's talking about short vowels. Short vowels sometimes weaken. That is, the vowel A, or A, I should say. I'm going to use the Latin names, so don't let that confuse you. The vowel A tends to become E, and then it becomes E, or O, and then U, while O tends towards E or E, and U towards E. So what that's saying is that vowels can change from a stronger sound to a weaker sound for the sake of pronunciation. So sometimes vowels will change, but they will always change in the direction of weakening. That's the first change in vowels. Let's just keep moving through this. So here we see for the vowel A, and we have a bunch of situations where the vowel is weakened. Here we see the vowel E with some situations where the vowel is weakened. The vowel E, the vowel O, the vowel U, the diphthongs A, E, and A, U. So those are all examples of weakening of vowels. And if you'd like to, you can read through that and make sure that you understand what's going on. The second change that happens to vowels is called omission. Omission. Vowels are frequently omitted or just left out. In simple and compound words, either within the word, so when a vowel is omitted within a word, that's called syncope. When a vowel is omitted at the end of a word, it's called apocope. So for example, here's a quick example. We see the word dextera, but we'll also see that word spelled and spoken as dextra. You can see that the vowel E is omitted. This is an example of syncope. The vowel is omitted from the middle of the word. We see another example here. Let's see if we can find an example of apocope. Here we have an example of apocope. We have neo from neve. So we have examples where vowels are simply omitted. That's omission, the second kind of change, the second kind of variation that takes place with vowels. So first, we have weakening back up here at the beginning, the first kind of variation. And secondly, we learned about omission. Third, we have epenthesis. Epenthesis. Vowels are sometimes inserted into words, and notice the reason why, to ease the pronunciation. Vowels are sometimes inserted into words to ease the pronunciation. So here, for example, we see the stem of this word is agero, or er in Latin. Now, to pronounce this by itself as a nominative would be very difficult, so the vowel e is inserted. This is an example of epenthesis. The vowel is inserted to ease the pronunciation, and we say ager, rather than trying to pronounce ager. We add the vowel to make pronunciation easier. That's an example of epenthesis. So we've learned weakening, omission, and epenthesis. Fourth, the fourth kind of variation that takes place is called assimilation. Assimilation. Two vowels in adjoining syllables tend to become like each other. That's what assimilation means. Assimilation means to become like each other. And a good example of assimilation or illustration, if we take a cup of cold water and a cup of warm water and we mix them together, what happens? The cold water becomes warmer and the warm water becomes colder. They assimilate. They become like one another. That's assimilation. So when we have two words, or two syllables we should say, and they come together in the form of a word, the ending sounds of the first syllable and the beginning sounds of the syllable, of the second syllable, come together and they can assimilate or become more like one another. They can change so that they're more similar. So it's like one sound between them. Let's look at an example. Sometimes this is regressive. The first vowel becomes like the second vowel. Sometimes it is progressive, the other way around. So we've got examples here. Here, for example, we see in the ending here we have the u, but in a related word where the ending is is, we have the is sound in the ending, which is necessary. The vowel in the stem assimilates to become like it, to make it easier to pronounce. It would be very difficult to pronounce something like faculis. Just try pronouncing that, faculis. And the reason why it's difficult is because the place where the vowel sound is produced has to change. Whereas if we just assimilate the vowels, facilis is much easier to pronounce, facilis. Likewise, we have famulus, famulus, where the us ending is necessary. The vowel in the stem changes or assimilates to become like it, famulus. Whereas in familia, where the ending is ia, the vowel in the stem assimilates and becomes e, familia, famulus. It would be much more difficult to say familus or famulia. It's much easier to pronounce these words with assimilated vowels, familia, famulus. Here also we have bonus, where the ending is us, but if the ending for the adverb bene is e, the vowel in the stem is assimilated and becomes like the ending. Bene is much easier than pronouncing bone. So you can see the simple concept of assimilation, how the vowels change so that they become like one another and make it easier to pronounce those words. So that's the fourth kind of variation. Next, in note 5 here, a vowel before a liquid tends to become U, short U. A vowel before a liquid, that would be L, M, N, or R. A vowel before a liquid tends to become U. Sometimes, but less often, it becomes O or E. Some examples here. We have adolescens, adolescens in classical Latin, adolescens, and here we see adolescens. Vulgus and vulgus, decumus and decem. So we can see that a vowel before a liquid, here we have decem, but before a liquid we see that it changes to U, as this variation tells us. Here we have temporis, which is the genitive case, so the stem would be tempor with an O in the stem. But here we have that O changing to U before an S, which can be considered a liquid. So you see the vowel before a liquid tends to become U because it makes it easier to pronounce. Because the place in the mouth where the sound U is made is closer to the place in the mouth where the liquid sounds are made. It's just for the sake of easier pronunciation. So we learned 5 variations that commonly take place in vowels. The first was weakening, back up here at the beginning. We learned about weakening. Then we learned about omission, then epenthesis, assimilation, and changing to U before a liquid. 5 common variations that happen to vowels. Now, again, you don't need to know all of that detail, and I don't even know all of this detail, because this is really useful when you run into something that looks strange. Sometimes you'll run into a Latin word and you'll just say, I've never seen that before. Something looks strange, and you may look it up in a dictionary and find, well, it's not in the dictionary. So now it looks really strange. When you run into things like that, sometimes what's going on is that there's some kind of vowel change taking place, and it's causing it to look different than it normally looks. And so while you don't need to know all of these details, if you do run into a situation like that sometime, you can consult this article here and read through it and try to find a possible cause of your confusion. So those are the 5 common variations that take place among vowels. In Article 9, we look at the variations that take place among consonants. We learn the first type of variation, just as with vowels, is assimilation. When 2 consonants come together in Latin, they tend to assimilate one to the other. And all that means, we have a good example here, it means that the consonant sounds change so that together they're easier to pronounce. So for example, the verb scribo, scribere, if we were to add a participle, a perfect participle ending to it, we would have scribtum, which is very difficult to pronounce. Try it, scribtum, scribtum. But if we change that be to a pe, it becomes much easier. Scriptum, scriptum. And the reason why, as we learned in the previous lesson, is because te is not voiced. So to combine a voiced consonant with an unvoiced consonant is awkward. So we remove the voice. And instead of saying ba, we say pa, scriptum. The pe is much more like the te, makes it easier to pronounce. Here we have the preposition ad being joined to the verb cedere in classical Latin, ad cedere. And you can see that's very difficult to pronounce. Ad cedere, ad cedere. But if we simply assimilate these consonants, we can change that letter de into a ke and say akedere, akedere, which is much easier to pronounce. And we see this through many words, and you'll see this all through grammar, but understand that, when you're looking at the stems of words or looking up words in the dictionaries, in different forms, the consonants may change. They may assimilate. That's the first kind of variation among consonants. Second, we have partial assimilation. Partial assimilation. And we've got a couple different examples. You can see letter A here shows one type of partial assimilation, and then down here you'll see letter B, which shows another type of partial assimilation. So let's just read this so we get a good idea of what this is about. The sonants ge and be before the surd te. Surd means voiceless. So these two voiced consonants before the unvoiced consonant te or the sibilant consonant s often become surds. So ge will become ke and be will become pe. The surds pe, ke, and te, and remember surds just means unvoiced consonants, pe, ke, and te, before liquids sometimes become sonants. That is, when these voiceless consonants are found before liquids like L, M, N, or R, they sometimes become voiced consonants like be, ge, and de. The labial consonants pe and be, when they come before N, become M, because M and N are both nasals, but M is a labial nasal. So it's more like pe and be. The labial M, when it comes before guttural consonants, before dental consonants, and before the labials F and the consonantal U, becomes N. So just as N sometimes converts to M, so also M sometimes converts to N. The dental sound N before the labials P, B, and M becomes M. And so we just see this concept of assimilation. And remember, you can drive yourself nuts by trying to learn all of these different changes, but there's really just one simple principle. What is the one simple principle? It makes the language easier to pronounce. That's the only rule. So if you just think about the pronunciation of the different sounds, all of these variations will be easy to understand. Let's go and look at the next one. Complete assimilation. There are many varieties of complete assimilation, but the most important principle is that a mute or a liquid tends to assimilate to a liquid and to a sibilant. A mute or a liquid consonant sound tends to assimilate to a liquid and to a sibilant. So for example, let's just find a good example here. We have for the verb cedere or cedere in classical Latin, the stem or root of that verb is ced, ced. But if we need to join it to the ending C that starts with the sibilant S, it's difficult to pronounce. Kedsi, kedsi. So what happens? That de just assimilates to S, and we have kesi. Now, why does this matter? Well, the reason why this matters is because stems change. Let's say for vowels, stems change. And if you look up a verb in a dictionary, you'll notice that the present tense has one stem, and the perfect tense has a different stem, and sometimes the stems look completely different. But they're not really completely different. It's just that there's assimilation taking place. The consonants, when joined to different endings, assimilate, and that causes some strange-looking combinations of stems when you're looking them up in a dictionary. But if you understand the concept of assimilation, those changes become easy to understand. The fourth kind of variation that happens to consonants has to do with prepositions. So prepositions have certain spellings, but when they're followed by other nouns, because that's what preposition means, it means it's placed before a noun, the noun that follows the preposition will begin with a certain consonant sound. And if those two sounds don't work well together, the sound or the spelling of the preposition will change to become more like the noun. So let's look at some examples. One of the most common ones you'll see has to do with the preposition ab, which means from or away. Ab is often joined to other parts of speech, and when it does so, it changes. The preposition ab takes the form of a. In other words, it drops the be, it drops the consonant ending, and is simply a before the sounds m or the consonantal u, and in afui appears as au fero. So that beginning there, au, is actually the preposition ab with the consonant changed to make it easier to pronounce. Likewise, whereas sometimes ab drops the b and becomes a, there are also times where ab adds s and becomes abs before ke and te. It can even become as before the consonant pe. So you'll see this all the time, and we'll comment on it, but you have a list here, and you can see how helpful this is. You have the changes that take place to the preposition ab, the changes that take place to the preposition ad. We have ante, cum, ex, ob, sub, tran, amb, and so on. So these changes are very common, and this is also very helpful when you're studying to learn English words and how they are derived from Latin words. Sometimes the English words won't look exactly like the Latin words because these changes are taking place, and the preposition with the consonants at the ends of the prepositions are changing to other consonant sounds, and it may look like you've never seen that before, but if you understand that it's simply changes taking place with the consonants in prepositions, you'll realize you have seen these words before. You're just forgetting about the way that the consonants vary when they're joined to words that begin with different sounds. So prepositions are another source of changes with consonants in the language. Fifth, we have dissimilation. Dissimilation. So like assimilation, we now have dissimilation. To avoid the harshness of sound when two syllables begin with the same letter, the initial letter of the one is often changed. This is true especially of liquids, but occasionally of other letters. So we see singulalis, we see the la, lis, they would actually be the same. But this can be called alliteration in language, and sometimes it's a distraction. Sometimes it's annoying to say the same sound over again. So what happens is that second L is actually changed to become er, and we say singularis rather than singulalis, just to make it less distracting and easier to pronounce. Likewise, medi means middle and die means day. So the middle of the day, or noon, would be written medidie, medidie, but that sounds ridiculous. So this first day is changed to er, and we say meridie, meridie, and that's much more pleasant to hear and much easier to say. So dissimilation means we intentionally make the consonant sounds different to avoid an annoying repetitive sound. Sixth, just as with vowels, we have omission in consonants. We have consonants that are simply dropped. And you'll see that in examples in words you run into. Here, just as a simple example, we have the word villicus, and we'll have the omission of the double L. It'll be omitted. Here we see missi, and the double S, one is simply omitted, and the form is missi in Latin. So some consonants can simply be dropped. That's point 6. Point 7 is epenthesis again. That's the interposing of a consonant, adding a consonant to help with, to simply help with pronunciation. Here we see epenthesis with the addition of a pe in the midst of the word, because we have the stem m from the verb emo, and we have the ending tus. But instead of saying emtus, we add a p to make it a little easier to pronounce, and we say emptus. That makes it easier. So we add a consonant to help with pronunciation. Then we have one that's different from the vowels. We have epenthesis here, but we also have metathesis, or transposition of consonants. Transposition means the changing of position or the changing of place. Metathesis. This occurs sometimes in Latin, especially in perfect and supine forms. So look here, we have che, e, ere, but in another form of the same verb, the e and the ere are transposed. They're flipped. And the er comes first and the e comes second. So we go from kerno to crevi, okay, or crevi in classical Latin. So we see the changing places of the consonants. So that brings us to the end of the content in Article 8. So what we've seen here in Lesson 6, and remember, there's lots of detail here that you do not need to study at this time. What we've learned is that there are 5 different variations. I'm sorry for scrolling here. There are 5 different variations that take place with respect to vowels in Latin: weakening, omission, epenthesis, assimilation, and the changing of a vowel to u before a liquid in vowels. So 5 changes in vowels. And then we saw, what, 8 or 9? Let me just scroll down here real quick. We saw 8 changes with consonants, and let's just go back through them again. Assimilation, partial assimilation, complete assimilation, the changes with respect to preposition endings, dissimilation, omission, epenthesis, and metathesis. So we've got 8 changes for consonants that are common in Latin, and 5 changes for vowels. Let me say that again. We have 8 changes for consonants in Latin that are common, and we've got 5 changes for vowels that are common. 5 changes for vowels that are common, and 8 changes for consonants that are common. That's the real main idea of Articles 8 and 9. So you don't need to know all the details, but you should know what we're learning here in these 2 articles of the grammar text. We're learning about the variations of vowels, the 5 different kinds of variations of vowels that are common in Latin, and the 8 different variations of consonants that are common in Latin. That's the contents of Articles 8 and 9. So I hope that's a helpful first reading through these 2 articles. You don't need to know all of this stuff, but you should know what the different changes are, or what different kinds of changes there are. And again, as you begin reading Latin, as you begin doing translation work, just knowing that these changes take place, even if you don't know the details of the changes, just knowing that these changes take place will help you to not panic when you see a form that you feel like you've never seen before. It may simply be a place where there are some changes being made to vowels or consonants. So you can refer back to this section in Articles 8 and 9 and just read through it and look for that specific issue that you see in whatever it is that you're reading. So it's good to use as a reference. So study this for yourself, complete the lesson assessments, and once I see your assessment work and everything looks good, we'll be able to move forward in our study of Latin grammar. So I hope that's a helpful walk through Articles 8 and 9. If you've got any questions on these things, post them on the support forum on the course page, and I'll do my best to help you find some good answers to those questions. God bless.